Appreciate that. Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12 this morning. Week 3 of Thanks Leads to Giving. Once upon a time in a Silicon Valley, there lived a busy, important man. He routinely logged 12 to 14 hours a day at his job. Sometimes weekends, he picked up an MBA. He joined professional organizations and boards of directors to expand his contacts. He listened to business books on keeping up with the sharks and leadership lessons from Genghis Khan in his car. He found the 40-hour work week such a good idea. He tried to do it twice a week on most weeks. His wife tried to slow him down. She reminded him that he had a family. He knew that they weren't not as close as he hoped they would be, but he didn't really want him to drift away. It just seemed like it happened because he wanted a certain amount of time to be invested into his office, and he gave that time again and again to everyone besides his family. I'll be more available, he told himself, in 6 months or so when things settle down. And though he was a very bright guy, he didn't seem to notice that things just never really settle down. He knew that he was not taking great care of his body. His doctors told him he had some pretty serious warning signs. He had elevated blood pressure and high cholesterol, and so he thought, well, I'll just get rid of that. So he just quit going to the doctor. There'll be plenty of time for that some other time when things settle down. He recognized that his life was out of balance. His wife would nag him about going to church. There was that church, down the street from where he lived. He prided himself on being a practical man who lived in the real world where money is how you keep score. Besides, I can be spiritual without the local church, he said to himself. There'll be plenty of time for that sort of thing when things settle down. One day, the chief operating officer of his company came to him and said, "You won't believe this. Things are booming to such an extent that we can't keep up. It's a miracle. If we catch this wave, we'll be set for life. It'll require some more changes. It'll require more time. It'll require more energy. But if we don't overhaul this operation right now from top to bottom, it'll be a disaster." And so it hit him. He'd put his company through a technological revolution. He thought up a new company motto: "We live for this and this alone." He thought that was such a great idea to have it printed out on everything, on the new business cards. He said to his wife that night, "Do you realize what this means? We can relax. One day our future is going to be assured. We're going to be set for life. I know the market. I've covered every base. I've anticipated every contingency. This means financial security for us. And we'll finally go on that vacation you've been pestering me about for years when things settle down." But of course, his wife had heard this sort of thing, and she had learned not to get her hopes up. And 11 o'clock, she went to bed, of course, all by herself, as usual. As he sat down before his terminal, rearranging the universe, there was only one microscopic detail that escaped his attention. An artery that had been once as supple as a blade of grass was now as dry as plaster and as stiff as old cement. Every cigar, every pat of butter, every angry word, every irritated filled drive in the car during bad traffic hours, every self-preoccupied thought had done its work. And for more than a half a century, his heart had been pumping, and now it skipped a beat. And then another, and then a third, and then he found himself gasping for air and clutching his chest, and even though he sat at the top of 100 organizational charts, it turns out he wasn't even in control of his own pulse. He just couldn't get it to settle down. His death was a major story in the local community, in the financial community. His obituary was written up in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. And then it came to the memorial service. People asked the same foolish question people ask when somebody else rich dies. I wonder how much he actually left. And of course, the answer is he left it all, because everyone always leaves what's left behind. They commissioned a large marble memorial column for him. On it, they wrote these inspiring words like visionary and innovator and leader and entrepreneur. And at the top of it, they wrote this favorite word that he had: success. And then it was dark and no one was present to know what was taking place. The angel of God was sent to his cemetery, and he came to the man's wonderful memorial stone. And the angel traced with a finger the single word God had chosen to summarize this wealthy, busy, respectable, good, successful man and his life. And it was one word, the word fool. And God said, you fool. This very night your soul will be required of you, and the things that you've stored up, whose will they be? By now you may have recognized that this is a version of the story first told by Jesus in Luke chapter 12, 2,000 years ago. And Jesus tells this story, and he sums up the lesson in a single sentence to make sure that no one missed the main point. And it says this, so it is for everyone who accumulated riches for themselves, but are not rich toward God. And that's where we pick up in this final week of Thanks Leads to Giving in Luke chapter 12. Jesus is telling this story. The occasion for the present discussion is a complaint by one brother against another brother over an argument. I know you can't guess this. Over an argument about their father's inheritance. I mean, that never happens here, right? That only happens to people out there. And Jesus here, he's going to be treated like a rabbi. He's going to be asked to be an arbitrator on the family squabble. And except this request is not for Jesus to be an arbitrator, but to be an advocate for one brother as he petitions the other brother because he thinks the money that's going to be left behind should be given to him in a certain way. And Jesus is going to approach this in an interesting way in Luke chapter 12. Let's start in verse 13. So if you have this morning a Bible app or Bible open to Luke chapter 12, verse 13, will you say, I got it? Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. And he says, man, who made me judge or arbitrator over you? Of course, his calling is different, Jesus knows. And then he says to them, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, because life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Jesus is going to give this man a warning as he's running so quickly to kind of win the debate with his family about the inheritance. And Jesus is going to warn him. He's going to warn anyone who will listen. He's going to warn the writers of the gospel. And he's going to warn us in the 21st century, hey, watch out. Be on your guard. Because in this world, there's all kinds of greed. Because in your heart, because in your flesh, you're going to have a temptation to succumb to all kinds of greed. But remember this, life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And this is the exact sermon you wanted to hear in December as we head toward Christmas. This is the exact sermon that I wanted to preach on our way to Christmas. But the reality, friends, is not just December. All year, you and I have to be warned by Jesus to be on guard. In fact, Jesus uses a military term, watch out. It's being on guard duty. Because in this world, we face troubles of many kind. And one of the troubles that has all kinds of trouble is greed. And if you're not careful, you can actually be overwhelmed by this temptation that Jesus points here to have an insatiable desire for more. To allow your desire for possessions and the abundance of things and this thing and that thing and even though they're good things to be ultimate things, and then they become ultimate things that actually lead our heart astray from the will and the ways of God. And before you know it, we can be overwhelmed with greed. That's not where we started. That's not where we wanted to go. That's not where we were headed. But suddenly we start to realize that our heart's affection and our mind's attention is consumed with having more. And greed, friends, greed leads to all kinds of problems. Here's a few. Greed, first of all, it confuses self-worth. If you're taking notes, you want to just write that down. Greed confuses self-worth. Greed begins to make you think that the pay you bring home, if it's increased, now you have more worth. Greed begins to whisper in our hearts that we're defined by what we have, or what's in our wallet, or what we've invested, or what we have in the future, or what we drive, or where we live, or what neighborhood we're in, or what we wear. And greed confuses our self-worth. Secondly, another thing that you probably have seen greed do. Now, probably not any of us in here, but people that we know, greed ruins relationships. In fact, this is the problem that this man's having. He's bringing to Jesus in Luke chapter 12, right? Hey, Jesus, can you get this straightened out? We've got a little problem here. There's a little a squabble between two brothers. And hey, Jesus, if you'll just tell the brother that I'm right and the way that I want to, handle the inheritance, if you just go ahead and be the arbitrator and just let him know that he's wrong and I'm right, and then we can kind of move on and things will be great. Isn't it interesting that Luke 12, and then again later, Luke 15, Jesus handles two situations with two different stories by basically letting us know that there's squabbles in Luke 12 about an inheritance, and there's a story in Luke 15 about an inheritance. Remember that story, Luke chapter 15? The story of what I would say the prodigal sons, the one who went away and the one who stayed. And actually the squabble is over what? The squabble is over the inheritance. It seems to be that from Luke 12 to Luke 15, there's this reminder over and over again that no matter who you are, no matter where you grew up, no matter where you're from, no matter what your socioeconomic status is, no matter where you live in this world, the reality is all our hearts are the same. And outside of God, all of us are tempted to what? To be consumed with greed. And if you're not careful, greed can ruin relationships. Come on, you've been there. You've had those family conversations. You've been at the dinner table when it got a little awkward because you were talking about the way your family was going to handle your money or someone else's money. You've seen how it's brought tension into friendships, into workplaces, and with your coworkers and those that you know all around you, because greed confuses self-worth. Greed ruins relationships, and greed hardens our hearts. The man in the parable wants to keep it all for himself. He's got blinders on. He's wrapped up in himself. He's letting his joy be connected to his net worth. He's letting his happiness be connected to his happenstances. He's letting his faith be fastened to his finances. He's using comparison and competing more than he's thinking about why he's ultimately here on this earth. And friends, Jesus says here, even at Christmas, be warned, watch out for all kinds of greed, because your life doesn't consist in the abundance of possessions. And that's great news, isn't it? Like, think about it. Like, as fun as Christmas is, and as important as, getting around the tree with those that you love and those that you invested in and those that you care about, like, as great as that is, aren't you glad that when all of it's over at Christmas, you realize that this is ultimately not what your life is lived for? That your life is so much more than the boxes under the tree? Like, aren't you glad that your purpose is so much greater and grander and more eternal than that? And Jesus here, he gives us a warning, and he says, be careful the way you view your wealth, because if you're not careful, you'll have a tendency to not look through the lens of eternity, but look through the lens of the moment. If you're not careful, you'll actually forget that viewing your wealth through the lens of eternity loosens your grip on all that you have, and it loosens its grip on you. See, the main issue of this parable is not wealth. The main issue is not how much someone has. The main issue is that what they have has them. And that's the tempting thing about wealth, isn't it? Any possessions. Anything that we have, anything that we desire, the temptation is that eventually it owns us. And you know that feeling. We've all known that feeling. We've known that feeling because probably all of us in the room have had a credit card once or twice. And because all of us in the room have probably at one point or another purchased something and then realized that now the payment for that purchase is much greater than you originally thought on the original tag. And it took much longer. And it brought much less joy than you anticipated. And the reality is, Jesus is saying, listen here, friends, be warned, even in the season of Thanksgiving to Christmas, be warned that everything you have is not for yourself, but it's actually for a greater cause. Here's the dangerous assumption that's made in Luke chapter 12. Here's the dangerous assumption. If you're taking notes, here it is. Everything that is placed in my hands is not for my consumption. It moves on in chapter 12 and verse 16. And he tells him this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. And then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns, and I'll build bigger ones, and there I'll store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. You notice what's happening here? In the story, this parable, Jesus is giving this illustration. And he says basically this person talks to himself 5 times. Now, we've all been concerned before when we've been caught talking to ourselves, right? I want to ask you to raise your hands for those of you who do that on a regular basis. If it helps you, okay, God bless you. But it's not just talking to himself that's the problem here. It's that he's talking to himself about himself that's the problem here. And if you'll notice, if you're taking notes, you can even put some circles around there. Have you noticed in the parable, this person is saying, I, and me, and mine, and my fruit, and my barn, and my goods, and my plans, and my bigger things. Because ultimately, as Jesus tells this parable, he's giving an earthly story with a heavenly meaning to say, listen, this person has decided that their life is about themselves. That this person has decided that all they've been given and all they've received from the Lord is not simply something for them to steward and to manage for God's work, name, and fame, but instead it was given to them to basically consume. And Jesus uses this parable and says, listen, this shouldn't be true of those who are following after Jesus. There's an author who wrote a book called Death Warmed Over. I'm sure it's a book that you've already had on your shelf. It's a combination cookbook and sociological study of funeral meals and rituals. It sounds like really encouraging stuff, right? In this book, the author, Lisa, she starts with a story of a man dying at home in bed. He could smell the aroma of his wife's famous chocolate chip cookies. His favorite baking is going on downstairs, but he's actually in the last moments of his life. And so he thinks, do I want to just lay here and die? Or do I want to have one more chocolate chip cookie? He decides he wants one more. So he drags his body out of bed. He rolls down the stairs. Some of you guys are thinking about that cookie you'd be willing to do this for, right? He rolls down the stairs. He crawls into the kitchen. He reaches out a trembling arm to grasp one final cookie, and suddenly he feels the sting of a spatula smacking him on the hand, and his wife saying, put that back, they're for your funeral. See, the rich man, he had so many cookies. He thought they were all for himself. And friends, this is the essence of greed. If I can just get one more, even in my dying breath. The essence of greed is keeping what God has given you, thinking He gave it to you just for you. But that's not the essence of a follower of Christ. That's not the heart of those who are chasing after God. Instead, Jesus has actually given us an indication here that those who are following God will have a different trajectory, have a different idea, have a different thought and vision in mind. Instead of taking all that they have and consuming it for themselves, instead they say, Lord, everything you have, may it then spur in me a desire to be rich, not toward myself, but toward God and His work in this world. You see, Jesus tells a story, and this guy keeps building bigger barns and storing more grain and thinking one day I'll settle down and I'll be able to enjoy it all. I'm going to use this for myself. But friends, Jesus says, watch out for that mentality. Like watch out. Because so subtly, so unintentionally, your heart can be aimed the same direction. And Jesus gives this parable here, and he says, listen, you don't get rewarded for what you leave behind. You get rewarded for what you give and send on ahead. God says to this man who lost it all, who missed it all, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. And what will you get? What would you, just something you left behind? No, you should have been rich toward God and sent it on ahead. So here's another principle. Just to remind us here in December, here's the principle. Being rich toward God is always, listen, always greater than keeping it for yourself. It is. I wonder if we actually believe that. Teenager, has anybody ever told you this? Young adult, has anybody ever taught you this? Newly married couple, is this the conversation that's happening in your home? Single adult, have you been thinking about how you could be rich toward God? Elderly couple, you had all those plans, you had all those things that you're thinking about you're going to do. How is it that the conversation's leaning toward being rich toward God? Because listen, friends, you never fail when you're rich toward God, but you can be a fool and keep it for yourself. And we have a decision to make. Listen, every one of us have a decision to make, and God's inviting us in. He's giving us an invitation. Listen, God is sovereign. God does rule and reign. God will do a work. God will have His way. The problem is that if we continue to say, I'll keep it all for myself, we won't be a part of the kingdom. And we won't see God's work among us. God's work will go further and will go faster. It just won't happen here where we're at. And the concern here is, Jesus says, listen, this man forgot what it looks like to be rich toward God. And ultimately, Jesus has a really tough message for this man. He calls him a fool. Now, you ever been called a fool? Maybe you've ever been called something kind of close to it? Kind of hurts, doesn't it? The Old Testament term for fool means someone who either acts without God or acts without wisdom in a destructive way. In other words, they're not just being foolish about something, their entire life has been destructive to them and to others because they've been refusing to be rich toward God. Some of us remember growing up and longing for the day when Christmas would finally arrive, right? Maybe this is your conversation with some children or grandchildren in your home, or a nephew and niece, right? And everybody's excited, and we should be excited. It's a great time about, what's going to be under the tree and what kind of surprise is going to be there. And maybe you remember having like the list of all the things that are going to happen, the next, that infamous Christmas morning, and the gifts you're going to open up, and man, it's going to be this and your favorite this thing. How many of you guys grew up with like heroes? You had like superheroes, right? Marvel or DC? How many of you guys Marvel? Anyone? How many of you DC? Great. 3 of us ever did anything superhero. The rest of us were too mature for that all our entire life. No, let's try it again. Marvel, anyone? DC, anyone? How many of you like me, you have no idea the difference? Awesome. Okay, thank you. I remember getting so excited about what's going to be under the tree. For me, it was like Hulk, right? I loved Hulk growing up. That was a big deal. For some of you, like Superman. Superman was a big deal, right? Some of you remember the story. Some of you guys have watched the movies about Superman. And Superman is so powerful, so amazing, right? Some of you even have like your favorite Superman. Which one's the favorite one? But the reality is all the superpowers of Superman, and he has one weakness, and his one weakness is what? Kryptonite. And Superman can do all these amazing things until he's around kryptonite, and now he's in trouble. Listen, friends, the reality is generosity is to materialism what kryptonite is to Superman. Generosity and being rich toward God begins to chip away the hardening of your heart toward the things of God, the work of God, and beginning to believe that your life is all about the abundance of possessions and the things that you have. And instead of those things controlling you, you begin to control those things. And here's how you do it. Let me give you three ways to encourage us, even at Christmas, on how to begin to be rich toward God. Number 1, 3 P's, because, pastors do this. 3 P's. The number 1, priority. Make generosity a priority. We have a lot of things in our homes that are important, don't we? Like maybe for you, being around the table and eating the meal is important. Maybe for you, Teaching a good work ethic is important. Maybe for you, it's your kids having certain grades. That's important. Maybe for you, it's athletics, or maybe playing in the band or playing an instrument. That's priority, and you schedule a lot of things around that. And listen, all of these things are really good things. But can I just encourage you to make generosity a priority? Can I just encourage you? Can I challenge you? Can I maybe even be radical enough to employ you, to command you, if I could, to make generosity a priority, to say, listen, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord, and the way we're going to serve the Lord is we're going to be generous, we're going to be rich toward God. We're going to be engaged in His mission. We're going to do all we can in ways that we can, in creative ways, in supernatural ways, in faithful ways, in God-given ways, in grace-filled ways, in private ways, and public ways, to make generosity a priority in being rich toward God and His work. Would you consider that? Like, of all the priorities we have, guys, the world is just tempting us to put all these things preeminent. And listen, all of them one day, all of them, they're just going to be where rust and moth destroy. They're just going to fade away. They're going to be nobody's going to remember. But listen, the things that we invest and implement into the kingdom of God, the priority we give in generosity, listen, it will come back to us 100-fold, not just in this world, but for eternity, over and over and over again. And it will be completely worth it. There's no one gets to the end of their life and thinks, man, if I could have just been a little more stingy, that would have been a better life. But can I be honest with you? All kinds of people. Listen, all kinds of people. And I know because I'm with them. All kinds of people and their families, when they get to their final days, they wish they could have been more generous to the work of God. Make it a priority. Number 2, percentage. Percentage. If you're going to be rich toward God, it can't be on accident. It can't. Sometimes giving and generosity is spontaneous. How many of you guys love it when a friend or coworker or a family member just decides spontaneously to be generous toward you? Right? It's kind of nice, right? Oh, you're going to buy the meal? No, let me buy the meal. And then secretly you're going, okay, I'll let you buy the meal. That's awesome. Didn't expect that, right? It's spontaneous. But listen, the best generosity is not always spontaneous. A lot of generosity is planned and intentional and habitual and routine and regular. And part of generosity could be that you could take a step from not only placing it in priority, but putting a percentage on it. It helps you hold accountable. It helps you plan. It helps you understand where your money is going. And some of us have never been taught what it looks like to have percentage giving. We know this in the Bible is called tithing. It's the training wheels of generosity. It helps us even at a young age to learn what it looks like to place God in priority in His work. You can do that. You can step out on faith. You can begin to put the discipline and the habits and the routines to being generous. And one of the ways you do that is through percentage giving. On the wall of President Lyndon Johnson's White House office hung a framed letter written by General Sam Houston, the Johnson's great-grandfather. George W. Baines, more than 100 years earlier, Baines had led Houston to Christ, and the general was a changed man, no longer coarse and belligerent, but now peaceful and content. And after General Houston was baptized, an incredible event happened. He became incredibly generous, more generous than anyone could ever imagine. And people began to ask him, like, hey, why are you so generous? And you know what his response was? It became pretty infamous. Well, you see, when I was baptized, I understood that my pocketbook was baptized too. And he would tell that to anyone who would listen. Friends, there's a concern. Jesus says, watch out, because you could actually think that you really love God, and yet you're not rich toward Him. And you know what that is? That's foolish talk. Because thankfulness actually leads to giving. And giving When you're generous and you're rich toward God, you're going to put it as priority. And when you're rich toward God, you're going to put a percentage on it. And you're going to begin to ask God today, God, how can we... Listen, if any of us want to get in shape, what do you have to do? You have to set a routine of exercise, right? Because, who actually just wakes up in the morning and goes, this is going to be awesome. I think I'll just exercise today. Nobody. And who right before they go to bed, I think I'll just exercise today. Or who goes on I think I want to get really disciplined with the way I eat, but I don't want to schedule anything or think about how I'm going to eat tomorrow. No, it's just spontaneous. No, it never works, right? The reality is you have to schedule it. And the challenge is if we don't schedule it, plan it, routine it, and get some discipline about it, it won't ever happen. Recently, my son's hand was injured, and then we kind of tried to ignore it for a while, and then when he got another injury on the same hand, and we thought, okay, I'm a really bad parent, I should probably take him to the doctor. I went to the doctor and found out he had an injury, and found out he had to put on a cast, and he had to walk around with that cast for several weeks, and even, like over 2 months, and after a while, just even though he's young, and even though he has all this energy, he gets the cast off. What do you find out? The cast has been removed, and in just a matter of weeks, the same hand that was strong and able and capable, now what? Now is not as strong. It seems to be kind of weak. It seems to be kind of, right, having some apathy or atrophy developing in the muscles. Why? Because it hasn't been used like it used to. And friends, the reality is most of us grew up in homes. We don't know about generosity because we were never trained to use generosity muscles. And one of the generosity muscles is priority and percentage. And you've never built it in. And the reason you're weak at percentage giving is because you've never exercised that muscle. And until you decide to have some discipline and exercise that priority percentage, then you'll never grow in being rich toward God. But you can start today. And God can give you the wisdom and the power and the discipline to do it. Number 3, progress. Progress. To grow or to make progress means that over time you grow in understanding priority, being rich toward God. You grow in percentage. And listen, there are some people who are hearing this message. And I know, right? I know all of you woke up this morning and thought, man, I cannot wait. I really hope that Casey just leans in on me about generosity during Christmas. That's going to be a great time. But here's the reality. The reality is, some of us have been Christians for a long time, and we set a percentage years and years ago, and now we kind of walk around kind of prideful because we're percentage givers, because we're priority givers. And yet the reality is, if you look back the last 20 years, you've not actually grown in your giving at all. Like, think about it. The older we get, studies show this all the time, right? The older we get, the less risk we like to take, right? So the older we get, the more unlikely we are to be people who jump out of a plane with a parachute, right? How many guys are not interested in that? How many guys used to think it was a good idea, now it sounds like the worst thing ever, right? The older we get, the less likely we think, hey, I think next month I'll run a half marathon. That'll be awesome, right? That you're not going to do that. The older you get, like, hey, I think I'll go max out on some weights. You're not going to do that. Like, the older you get, hey, I'm going to go across the world to a closed country to visit some people who've never heard of Christ. You're not going to do that. You're just going to, the older you get, the less risk you take. But here's the concern. Sociology in the natural says that's how we become, but here's the concern. It also happens the longer you've been a Christian. The longer you've been a Christian, the more comfortable you get in the way and how you give, and the less risk you're willing to take. But should that really be how it is? Like, if we're growing in Christ, if we're becoming more mature in Christ, if we understand more about Christ, if we understand the Word more, and we're putting it in our mind more, and we're around more Christians, and we're understanding more the mission of God, it should be that we're taking more risk, that we're giving in greater faith, that we're growing in deeper obedience, that we're being more serious about being rich toward God. Not that we're looking back like, yeah, I've been around, I've done this priority percentage thing for a long time. But what about progress? What about growth? What about new obedience? What about new risk? What about stepping out saying, God, I'm going to test you and be rich toward you and see how you just don't make my heart expand to the kingdom of God. Like, that's what I want, don't you? Like, don't you want that? Maybe we don't. Like, don't you want that? Like, some of us, can I just pastor you for a moment? Like, some of us want our kids to love Jesus. And we won't even get them up in the morning to come to church. And we just hope they make the right choices. We want to be good, moral people. Man, forget that. I want them to be in love with Jesus. And you know what happens? Everything else starts to follow in the right order. Like some of us want our kids, man, I hope are good kids, right? And they haven't seen you be generous toward the work of God or the mission of God in years. But they see you get super fired up about things that don't matter a dime in a few months. So maybe God would quicken us and awaken our own hearts toward the mission of God and being rich toward Him. And maybe we'd see some progress. Maybe we'd even embrace percentage giving in a new way. But ultimately, maybe we just make being rich toward God the priority. Because, man, I've done some foolish things. But Jesus says, watch out. Because this world has all kinds of greed. And if you're not careful, you can actually be consumed by it. And it will actually lead you to dying as a fool. Man, I don't want to be a fool. I want to be a child of God, being rich toward Him and His work. I want to see His work in my day go as far and fast as it can. I don't want to be the one holding it back. I want to be the one pushing it forward. Amen? May that be true of us. Let's stand for prayer. Father,